The Rangers could also tell that these Comanches were following that wagon. And as the Rangers continued to ride on, they eventually rode up to a scene straight out of a Hollywood movie where they found the smoking remnants of the wagon, the mutilated remains of the husband and the mother, and their older daughters who had been raped and killed. And from the tracks, though, they could tell that the two youngest children in the group had been taken alive, apparently. And so the Rangers continued following this set of pony tracks. They ride to the northwest, to the middle of nowhere in Texas. The weather turns bad. They run out of food. The lieutenant in charge has to make the hard decision to turn around and go back to the settlements to reprovender and get some warmer clothing. But as soon as they did that, they turned around and back-trailed themselves again in search of these Indians. Finally, just in the wilds of West Texas, and much anything west of this area in that period of time was the wilds of West Texas, a ranger just happened to look down and he spotted a piece of torn cloth in a brush. And so he knew that was unusual because they were so far removed from civilization. So he got off his horse and he kind of bent down to look under this bush, and sure enough, two little sets of eyes looked back out at him from underneath this bush. And it was the two kids. The kids had escaped the Indians. They were so far out that the Comanches apparently were confident that they would not try to escape, but pure instinct and fear, or instinct-born fear took over, and these kids ran, even though they were too young really to know what they were doing, and would have soon died from hypothermia out there in the middle of nowhere like that. But because the Rangers found them, that ended up saving their lives. The lieutenant in command had to make another hard decision, and that was, well, do I keep riding after the Indians, or do I, cut my losses and get these two kids back to what's left of their family? And he opted for the, I think, more humane choice of getting the kids back to their family. To me, that's the good that the Texas Rangers did back, especially in the 19th century. Now, an example of the bad happened in the 1870s, early 1870s. A ranger company was being recruited in Austin, and back in the 1870s, and really for a long time after that, hiring standards with the state of Texas were not nearly as exacting as they are today. In fact, to be a Texas Ranger back in this particular period of time, really about all you needed to do was be able to know how to ride a horse and shoot. English is whatever first or second language was certainly an option, but not really critical. As long as you could ride and shoot, hey, you were a Texas Ranger. So they recruited this company of Rangers in Austin, and because of these lower standards, no background checking, no testing, nothing like they do today, they hired a group of men, and they headed out toward Erath County, where they were supposed to be stationed. Well, one of the men that they had hired was just an out-and-out thief from Austin, and he soon proved it, because every time they would get anywhere near a small community, he'd ride off from the company, steal the town blind, then come back, rejoin the Rangers, and they would proceed north toward Erath County. Well, during this period of time, friction was beginning to develop between the ranger who was a thief and a ranger who was not. And the issue, interestingly enough, was not so much because the ranger was a thief, but just because the two rangers didn't hit it off. I mean, there just somehow friction developed there, and it escalated first from a cussing match, then to a fist fight, and finally one morning, the Rangers were sitting around their campfire drinking their morning coffee, and the ranger who was annoyed with the thief just walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head and killed him in front of all these other Texas Rangers. Well, that was too far even for these Texas Rangers. Nobody liked the thief. I mean, but the Rangers just couldn't abide by the fact that somebody would back shoot one of their own. If he was going to kill him, he at least should have shot him, front on instead of shooting him behind the back like that. So the Rangers thought, well, the only way to adjudicate this would be just to go ahead and get a rope and hang this ranger right now. And so somebody went out to find a rope, and they were going to, a la Lonesome Dove, they were going to string up this ranger for killing the thief, when the commander, again, the captain, interceded and reminded them that they were about protecting law and order and not enforcing the law themselves. And he said, we got to take this man into for civil authorities to handle this murder case. And indeed, that's what they ended up doing. They did not lynch the man. I found this story because another one of the Rangers ended up becoming a preacher, and he wrote a recollection about his adventures as a Texas Ranger, and I found that story in there, and I couldn't resist it and use it for my book. Interestingly enough, a lot of Rangers either were very religious people or moved off into some form of ministry after they got through being a ranger. But there was one ranger captain of a later era, in the later 1800s, who actually was a deacon in his church and always carried a Bible with him. And his thesis was that if he couldn't preach the gospel into somebody, he'd shoot the hell out of them, quite happily. And really, again, that was a pretty effective balance. So that's an example of what I would consider the bad. Well, let me tell you now just what I consider the plain old ugly. And that happened in 1874. A ranger company was up in Menard County, and they got into a tussle again with a bunch of Comanche Indians. The Rangers won. They killed all but one Indian. And there was one particular ranger named Scott Cooley. And Scott Cooley, depending on which source you look at, either his parents had been killed by Indians when he was real young, which sounds kind of Hollywoodish, or somebody in his family had had a loss to an Indian attack. But anyway, for whatever the reason, he did not like Native Americans. He was often known to literally, after killing them, to take a piece of their skin off and braid it into a quirt to use to inspire his horse to faster speeds. So he was not, a touchy-feely kind of guy. And with this one prisoner that they had, an Indian whose name turned out to be Little Bull, again, this guy, Scott Cooley, was going to just execute him right there on the spot. And once again, in this case, it was a lieutenant who was in command. He interceded and he said, no, we do not kill prisoners. We're going to take this Indian to Austin. So that's what they did. They put the Indian on a mule, their pack mule, and they traveled from Menard County through Fredericksburg and into Mason, Menard County, and then into Austin. They crossed into Austin on the south side of the river. There was no bridge, of course, at that time. They forded the river. They rode north up Congress Avenue, trailing this Comanche Indian behind them on a mule. The whole town turned out, all the saloons emptied, the businesses emptied to see this wild Indian, because this was 1874. By 1874, Austin was a pretty pacific place. There were a lot of people in Austin who'd never seen an Indian by 1874. The last time Indians had been much trouble in Travis County was back in the 1840s. So there was a whole generation of people living there who had never seen an Indian, as I said. So they come up to Congress Avenue. They turn left, and the lieutenant had told them, well, take him to the governor. Well, evidently security at the governor's mansion was about as bad then as it is now, because they took the Indian straight in to see Governor Richard Cope without any formalities or anything. And the governor just took one look at him and said, I didn't ask for any Indians. And so they didn't know what to do with him, so they booked him into the Travis County Jail, perhaps the first prisoner of war ever booked into the Travis County Jail. At some point along the way, perhaps in one of those bars on Congress Avenue, Ranger Scott Cooley had an idea. And then as now, state of Texas is never known for overpaying its employees. And back then, these rangers got $30 a month, whether they wanted it or not. And out of that, they had to deduct the cost of their six-shooter and their Winchester and pay the state of Texas back for that. So they didn't have a whole lot of money. Well, Cooley had this idea. I guess he'd taken note of how much attraction the Indian was getting as he drove up the avenue with him. And so he went to Miller's Opera House in Austin and conspired with the owner of the Opera House to print handbills and circulate them in town, announcing that a wild Indian lately captured by the Texas Rangers would be on public display for consideration of 25 cents a head at the Miller's Opera House. And so the good people of Austin, this was before Austin was officially weird, but they still would turn out to pay a quarter to see a wild Indian. And my gosh! So they got a good crowd for a performance or two there at the Opera House, and this ranger would would bring the Indian out on the stage, and they'd do their own little Wild West show there for the great enjoyment of the crowd, and they were raking in lots of money. But once again, even though that's just about as ugly as you can get to be displaying and making money off of a captive Indian, the Adjutant General of Texas, who at that time was oversaw the Texas Rangers, heard about what was going on and just hit the ceiling. I mean, he said that's not right. I mean, this guy was a fighter himself. He was a Confederate, a veteran. He'd been an officer in the Civil War. But that, in his opinion, again, was carrying things too far, and so he quashed any further performances involving Little Bull. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that story had a happy ending. They ended up taking Little Bull to Huntsville, to the state prison, and he got a disease there, and within a couple of years, he was dead. But at least he was not any further humiliated in Austin. So that's an example of, some of the ugly that they did. I really don't have a whole lot of patience with some of the revisionist historians who have tried to paint the Rangers as, just tools of the white establishment in Texas, who killed for land and practiced genocide. From what I've read and what I've seen, I just don't think that was the case. I think that most of these guys thought they were just doing their job, thought they were protecting the families along the frontier. Now, I will say, of course, and as I've said all along, I'm not at all trying to whitewash some of the things they did that were not right, and I've shared some of them with you today. It got particularly bad about 100 years ago, shortly after the Mexican Revolution broke out. By 1915, for all practical purposes, there was a guerrilla war underway in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Mexican nationals of various political stripe were raiding into Texas. They were overturning trains. They were killing people. They were cutting power lines. They were destroying irrigation pumps. They were conducting a guerrilla war in the state of Texas, to which the U.S. military responded, as well as the Texas Rangers. In fact, the governor brought every ranger in Texas to the Rio Grande Valley. Yes, a lot of Mexicans were killed. Some of them, I'm sure, were quite innocent. Can you believe my phone is ringing here while I'm giving a talk? We'll just turn that off. Nobody I know. I had that happen one time. It was my mother, but she's no longer with me, so I don't know what to... But anyway, that was a period that they've gotten a lot of criticism for. Certainly some of that criticism is justified. But again, I think it's been overpainted. I don't think they killed as many people as they've been credited with killing. There were never any records, of course, kept. The legend is that, skulls with .45 caliber holes in the center of their forehead were still being found in citrus groves in the Rio Grande Valley into the 1940s and 50s. Maybe. But certainly there were some abuses, but I just don't think there were that many abuses. Now, the happy ending is here that really for each successive decade after that time, the Rangers have continued to professionalize. They've got more and more legislative scrutiny. They've gotten to the point now where after I left the Department of Public Safety, they had, for several years, they had an African American who was the senior captain of the Texas Rangers, the highest ranking Texas Ranger. Right now they have a Hispanic who is the senior captain of the Texas Rangers. He's also the youngest they've ever had. He went in at the age of 44 and probably will be around for a good while because of that young age. And so things have totally reversed. I'll never forget when I was still with the Department of Public Safety when a U.S. Marine, depending on your perspective, either intentionally or accidentally, shot and killed a young Mexican goat herder in the Big Bend. The Rangers, I mean, I know, because I know the people who were involved in that case, they wanted to put that Marine in prison. I mean, they thought it was a murder, and they were angry about it. I mean, they took it personally, and I can still, most of them are retired now, but you could still get an animated conversation out of several Rangers that I could name you about that incident. So I think they swung around. I think that the bad things that did happen are in the past, and now I think they are back to the point where they really sort of match their legend. They actually are to a point now of living up to that long myth that they've had.